In January of 2026, the Pokémon Company president and CEO, Surikazu Ishihara, accepted the Andrew Yoon Legend Award for Industry Impact at the New York Game Awards on behalf of the Pokémon Company. During his acceptance speech, Ishihara reflected on his history with the Pokémon Company, as well as how the series has grown over the years. In particular, he highlighted how difficult it was to make the original titles, Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green. He said, "Pokémon originated from a small idea from the Game Freak development team. Wouldn't it be fun if you could catch creatures in a game and trade them with your friends? Everything started from that simple concept." Continuing, he said, "The development process, however, was not quite as easy. It took a great deal of trial and error to figure out how to actualize that idea with the limited resources we had available. In the end, it took 6 years to complete the first games, Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green. Still, we all felt confident in the main gameplay elements that would become the foundation of the Pokémon games series: catch, raise, trade, and battle." Many fans have reacted with confusion to this speech, with some asking how such primitive games such as Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green could possibly take 6 whole years to make, especially when modern titles like Scarlet and Violet seem to be released on a regular schedule, with a new generation arriving basically every 3 years. Plus, that's not even considering DLC. To put it in perspective, GTA 5 took 5 years to make, a huge, sprawling, ambitious game filled with content, places to visit, and things to do took a year less to make than Pokémon Red and Green. How does that happen? So, welcome to Culture Decks. My name is Nathan Ellensworth, and in this video, to clear up some confusion, we're going to explain exactly how Pokémon Red and Green took 6 years to make. Everything began in 1990, when Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori first pitched the game. The pair had met because Tajiri was creating and self-publishing a gaming magazine called Game Freak. Sugimori reached out to contribute upon seeing Game Freak on store shelves, and thinking he could help improve on the admittedly crude artwork. The pair worked together on the magazine before eventually forming Game Freak as a game development studio, thanks to Satoshi Tajiri's obsession with video games. Satoshi Tajiri was so obsessed with video games and how to make them better that he learned how to program and start developing games for the NES. The first title released by Game Freak was Mendel Palace, or otherwise known as Quinty in Japan. Mendel Palace was a moderate success, selling nearly 70,000 copies in Japan and around 60,000 copies in the US. This, as well as some favourable reviews, got Game Freak some attention, and soon after, they decided to pitch a game called Capsule Monsters to Nintendo, who rejected it. So yes, originally Pokemon was called Capsule Monsters, based upon the idea of collecting monsters and the capsules from gacha machines. Tajiri had grown up in rural Tokyo, spending a lot of time collecting bugs, and he wanted to recreate this experience in a video game, with many original Pokemon taking cues from animals and bugs, as well as kaiju and other monsters from Godzilla and other Toho media. However, Nintendo worried that they would run into copyright issues, especially with one of Pokemon's main inspirations. The 1960s Ultraman TV show saw the hero using small monsters in capsules to fight some bad guys. These were called Capsule Monsters. So, to avoid any legal difficulties, the game was renamed Pocket Monsters. Eventually, Tajiri met a rather famous game developer called Shigeru Miyamoto, thanks to their mutual friend Surikazu Ishihara. Miyamoto had played Mendel Palace, or Quinty, and had rather enjoyed it, so he decided to help Tajiri and Game Freak bring Pokemon to the Game Boy. So, in 1990, Pocket Monsters was once again pitched to Nintendo with the help of Shigeru Miyamoto, and this time accepted, with a preliminary release date of December 1991. Now, you may realise Pokemon did not, in fact, come out in 1991. It turns out there were plenty of issues for the Game Freak team, which mostly boiled down to technical difficulties, lack of funds, staff leaving Game Freak, and the steady creep of developing the many systems involved in the Pokemon games. From 1990 to 1991, development of Pokemon continued fairly steadily, but the team at Game Freak eventually realised they didn't have the money to finish the game, given how large in scope it had become. To earn some extra income, the team made the puzzle game Yoshi for the Game Boy and the NES. Yoshi was a genuine success, selling over 500,000 copies in Japan on its first day alone. This success, as well as its eventual release in the US, funded Game Freak for the foreseeable future. But as the development of Pokemon continued to stretch over the following years, Game Freak had to make several other games to help keep the lights on. Games such as Mario and Wario and Pulseman all came out well before Pokemon eventually made it to market in 1996. At certain points, Satoshi Tajiri would spend long stretches without any pay, relying on his father to help him out, and also spending hours and hours, if not days, in the office, regularly without going home. So yes, Pokemon took so long to make that it was hard to fund it, and the Game Freak team had to juggle multiple projects, all while still trying to keep the dream of Pokemon alive. Another major issue was technical limitations, stemming from the somewhat underpowered Game Boy. Pokémon was envisioned with the Game Boy's link cable in mind, so there was no moving platform. So, over the many years of development, the team had to figure out ways to make trading and battling work between two copies of the game. All of these technical difficulties, alongside the multiple projects, became too much for many staff members. In a biographical manga all about Satoshi Tajiri's life, one page explains how 3 programmers all quit on the same day, leaving many projects in limbo, including Pokémon. In total, only 3 people worked on Pokémon from the very beginning to the end, those being Satoshi Tajiri, Ken Sugimori, and Junichi Masuda. In fact, Masuda was initially just hired to make music for Pokémon, which he accomplished rather triumphantly, but during the troubled development of the games, he was eventually enlisted to help with programming. A similar journey took place for Shigeki Morimoto, who was originally hired to help design Pokémon, but eventually learned programming and was ultimately the main programmer responsible for Pokémon's battle scenes. Over the 6 years of development, many ideas were either changed, dropped, or added much later. Originally, players were going to buy Pokémon, with each creature having a specific price, and if players traded, they would have to pay any discrepancies between the two. At one point during development, Game Freak had well over 100 Pokémon ready to be included, but the team wanted players to be able to nickname their Pokémon, which would come at the cost of quite a lot of the Game Boy's limited RAM. This resulted in the team culling the amount of Pokémon to around just 30, or to keep the ability to nickname your Pokémon. Thankfully, Shigeru Miyamoto offered to help the team by supplying a Game Boy cartridge with more RAM, which helped bring the total number of Pokémon up to the iconic 151 that we know and love today. But even this wasn't without some downscaling, as the team had plenty of ideas and Pokémon designs that wouldn't fit, even with this greatly expanded power. So many Pokémon were cut altogether or saved for future entries. Meanwhile, the ability to have more than one save file per cartridge was also scrapped in favour of keeping nicknames. Another feature that was dropped was the idea of having different Pokémon on nearly every single cartridge, with the use of a random number generator dictating which Pokémon appear in your game. However, this was too ambitious for the Game Boy, and eventually this idea was scaled way down, and we only got the 2 copies, or 3 or 4, however you count it, of the original Pokémon generation. Trading also proved to be a programming nightmare, but was so intrinsic to the concept of Pokémon that it had to be figured out. The concept of trading came from Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori playing Dragon Quest together. In an interview for the Japanese book called Pokédex, released shortly after the release of Pokémon Red and Green, Tajiri explained, "In Dragon Quest, there's a rare item called the Mad Cap, and Sugimori was talking about how he had 2 of them. I'd spent so many days trying to get a Mad Cap of my own, but I just couldn't get one. So I just thought, well, since he has 2, why can't he give me one? So our original idea for Pokémon wasn't we want to make an RPG, instead it was we want to trade. Alongside trading, another technical difficulty was battling, but Nintendo was adamant the feature had to be included. Early playtests saw the battles play out automatically, with gamers just watching them, but feedback called this boring, so work had to be done to make the battles the interactive version that we see now. In an interview with Retro Gamer in 2016, Junichi Masuda explained one of the many reasons battles took so long to program, saying, "Once we were happy with our designs, we started working on the moves they could each use. This process probably accounted for around 3 of those 6 years. It was quite the task. There wasn't an initial plan of which Pokemon would get which moves. We designed the Pokemon, then designed the moves, then decided which would fit well together as a gradual process." So yeah, the Game Freak team were trying to make something really ambitious on the limited Game Boy hardware, but it had to be done a certain way. So it's no surprise it took them years to eventually cram all of those features into one game. Some of the technical difficulties were entirely mechanical, and one particular issue nearly caused development of Pokemon to be lost forever. Speaking in an interview with Polygon, composer and programmer Junichi Masuda said, "We had a really bad crash that we didn't know how to recover the computer from. That had all of the data for the game, all of the Pokemon, the main character, and everything. It really felt like, oh my god, if we can't recover this data, we're finished here. I just remember doing a lot of research. I called the company that I used to work for, seeing if they had any advice to recover the data." Eventually, Masuda contacted an internet service provider for help and even read English language books on the Unix systems because of a lack of the information in Japanese. As you may have guessed, the team was, thankfully, eventually able to recover the data and continue with development. In a video released to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Pokemon, Masuda further explained that the computers he worked on would regularly break down, and revealed that he went through 3 or 4 over the course of Pokemon's creation. Then, quite late in development, the idea came to split the game into 2 separate titles. This suggestion came directly from Shigeru Miyamoto, who thought putting different Pokemon in each game would further encourage trading. Recently, in an investor Q&A, Miyamoto also revealed that the spark for this idea came from a joke. Miyamoto said, A long time ago, before creating the first Pokemon game, Satoshi Tajiri, the director of Pokemon, joked with me that to surpass Nintendo's Mario, he'd have to sell 2 copies of the game to each consumer. That is one reason why Pokemon started with both Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green. I believe that new ideas are born precisely because of people like him, who challenged themselves to surpass what came before. Ultimately, Pokemon was an incredibly ambitious project, hampered by the technical limitations of the Game Boy, but needing the specific platform's unique properties to bring Game Freak's vision to life. The length of development caused major funding issues, and many team members found it difficult to balance the multiple other projects completed over Pokemon's 6-year development. Between 1990 and 1996, development on Pokemon was stopped and started again multiple times, whilst the team balanced other projects or completely scrapped or changed certain features. Over those 6 years, developers quit, computers crashed, nearly losing all of the development data, and it took an increasingly large team of talented programmers to eventually get the project over the finish line. There simply wasn't another title on the Game Boy with this scope, and features such as trading, battling, and even splitting the game into 2 separate titles all added significant pressure on the Game Freak team. In fact, in a 2010 Iwata Asks with Pokémon Company CEO Ishihara, he explained, Pokemon was originally completed and set to release in the holiday period of 1995, which is why the titles still have the 95 copyright. While no official reason is available, it's believed the last-minute delay was to squash bugs, with Pokemon eventually releasing on February 27th, 1996. So, there you have the story of Pokemon's original development in a rather truncated form. I've left out some details, but that's essentially the gist of things. Pokemon had an extremely troubled development, and it's only thanks to the hard work of some very talented devs, some programming magic, and the helpful oversight of Shigeru Miyamoto that we have the games at all. Nowadays, the Game Freak team consists of around 200 staff members, and Pokemon games have things like the existing battle mechanics, Pokemon models, and much more to inform their future decisions. While no Pokemon game is easy to make, the original had to try and forge a new path, and dealt with years of trial and error to craft a version of this adorable RPG that gamers everywhere would love. Well, we hope that clears some things up for you, and you learned something in the process. The articles and interviews we cited can be found in the comments, and sincere thanks to all of the talented people that have researched this subject in the past. For more Culture Dex content, be sure to like and subscribe and tell all of your Pokemon pals. And don't forget, you can find many Culture Dex videos in the What Culture Gaming podcast feed in audio form. Thanks for watching and sticking with us until the very end. We'll see you next time.